So how do you build a successful business? How do you create the best product? Here's what I learned from the Lean Startup. First, we have to understand that a successful business never goes as planned. Charles Darwin said, "It's not the strongest of the species that survive, but the most adaptable." The same thing applies with the business. When we first introduce our product or service to the public, it's not perfect. And it can't be. Because even if your design team thinks it's perfect, or you think it's perfect, it's not. Because the only person's opinion that matters is your customers. So in order to create the best product or service, you have to create something, anything that resembles your idea. Throw it out to your potential customers, learn from their reactions, and then create a better version that adapts to their needs. Before we get into the Lean Startup's build, measure, learn philosophy, I just want to show you how many changes a business typically goes through by sharing the story of my first business. A couple of years ago, I lived in an apartment with my mom and dad, and our utility bill was pretty expensive. It wasn't the kind where you pay depending on how much you use, but it was a fixed amount. So even if you used a lot of water or didn't shower at all, you'd have to pay the same amount. Then I started thinking, how could I use the unlimited water and electricity to make money? That's when I started my fish business. My business plan was to raise fish and sell them to pet stores. I've never had fish before, so I did some research and ended up buying guppies because they were easy to raise and they reproduce like crazy. Each mother has 30 babies every month. I started out with 6 guppies, and as planned, pretty soon I had over 200. I decided it was time to sell them, so I went to the local pet store. But unfortunately, they said they only bought from registered breeders because too many people were trying to sell their guppies. I didn't know what to do, so I tried selling them on Craigslist instead, but most people only wanted to buy like 5. At $1 each, the amount of work I had to do to scoop them up, meet the buyer, it wouldn't be worth the measly $5 I'm getting. So I had to either change my business plan or give up. Every startup shares the same characteristics. Since my business was small, if it failed at that point, I would have only wasted $500 or so from the aquarium equipment and everything. But most startups would require more money. So how could we test the waters ahead of time to see if there is a market for our product? The solution, according to the Lean Startup, is to create the most basic version of our product, called the Minimum Viable Product, or MVP. The purpose is to get feedback from customers as soon as possible. The minimum viable product has to be as basic as it can get, because its only purpose is to see if people like it. Any additional work beyond what's required to start learning is a waste. Sometimes the MVP is just a video or a web page. For example, video editing can make a product seem real without having to actually build it. The video could be launched to the public, and we could measure it by the number of people who click purchase. A lot of crowdfunding sites these days, like Kickstarter, actually help startups by giving them the opportunity to showcase their product to a large audience. In my fish business, for example, my minimum viable product could have been to create a Craigslist ad, or to ask the pet store if they would buy my fish before actually raising the fish. Once we have our minimum viable product, we go through a process called build, measure, learn. The idea is to have a product or service, build, measure its performance, measure, and then learn from it. And then the cycle begins again where you build a better product. The build, measure, learn cycle will continue as long as your business runs, because you always want to be improving what you do. You might notice that all large successful companies use the build, measure, learn technique constantly, so they always improve. If you look at anything you own, maybe your phone or your computer, chances are it's not the first of its kind. There was a version before it and then a version before that as well. At the end of each build, measure, learn cycle, we come to a point where we decide whether to improve on the product, to change direction, or to abandon it completely. A lot of times, a change in direction is all that's required. That change in direction is called a pivot. Let's say you decide to create a business making stuffed teddy bears. You make a teddy bear, no one buys it, so you interview 100 kids and ask them why they won't buy your teddy bear. And you find out that they like dragons instead. So then you decide to create stuffed dragons. Or another example is maybe you found out that the kids who like teddy bears were younger and they didn't have a say to what they wanted yet. So you decide to tailor the advertisements towards mothers instead. Those two are examples of pivots. When I realized that my local pet store only bought from breeders and that people on Craigslist only bought 5 at a time, I could have chosen to stick with my idea by asking other pet stores or maybe even become a licensed breeder, but I had a better idea. I had a few aquarium plants that grew pretty quickly, so I could just sell those instead. Guppies were actually pretty impractical to ship worldwide because the weight of the water would make shipping charges even more expensive than the price of the guppies. Plants, on the other hand, I could ship it worldwide. They could be kept in a Ziploc bag without water for 7 days before turning yellow. That's when I pivoted my business to selling plants. A lot of times, pivots don't require you to start the business from scratch again. In my case, I still needed all the fish tanks. I needed the fish as well because their poop actually acts as a fertilizer for my plants. A year down the road, I was making $800 a month. I continued to build, measure, and learn. Feeding the fish became too much work, so I installed automatic fish feeders. Orders were then only shipped once a week, so I could better use my time. Heat packs were used during the winter after I received a few complaints about their plants being frozen. All these improvements couldn't have been made if I didn't constantly measure, learn from it, and build something to improve it. At that point in time, I actually hadn't read the Lean Startup yet, but in hindsight, I was already using the techniques it taught. That, along with the concepts of automation and elimination, which I learned from the 4-hour workweek, which I had read at that time, they allowed me to create a simple but effective business. The build, measure, learn technique really teaches us the importance of always learning and improving your business. It also shows us that we have to get started, because we can't learn anything if we don't encounter problems. Also, to put things into perspective, the problems I mentioned were only 10% of all the problems I encountered. There was an outbreak in algae one time that made the water so green that the plants wouldn't grow. And another time, I sort of merged all the tanks together with pipes so I can filter the water with one central filtration unit, and that ended up flooding the whole room. But I learned each time something like that happened and made it better. My whole business experience taught me a valuable lesson. It's something that people with just a business degree won't learn. Hopefully you can learn from my experience, and remember, in order to win, all you have to do is learn faster than everyone else. And the fastest way to learn is to go through the build, measure, learn cycle as many times as you can. That's all for now. You can see my additional notes by clicking the link up there. If you enjoyed the video, you can show your support by clicking subscribe. If you didn't, subscribe anyway. It's free. See you next week.